Richard never thought he would see his daughter again. 14 years had passed since that cold winter night, when she disappeared from their home. He had searched, begged, and pleaded for answers, but nothing ever came. Eventually, time swallowed his hope, leaving only the dull ache of loss. But then the call came, a voice on the other end of the line, calm, clinical, telling him they had found her, Emily, his little girl. The next moments passed in a blur. The hospital address, the hurried drive through winding roads, the pounding of his heart, a desperate rhythm in his chest. And now he was here, standing in a cold, white hospital room, looking at her. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, staring blankly ahead. She was 20 now, a young woman, but there was something wrong. Her skin was pale, her eyes distant, as if she were looking through the walls, through him. She had the same black curls, the same delicate hands. But Richard felt it immediately. She wasn't the same girl who had vanished all those years ago. He took a hesitant step forward. Emily? She didn't react. The doctor, standing beside him, cleared his throat. She has difficulty remembering things, he said carefully. The trauma of being separated for so long, it can have severe effects on the mind. Richard swallowed hard. He didn't care. He would take her home, help her heal, be the father he had always wanted to be. He knelt in front of her, forcing himself to smile. "It's me, sweetheart. It's Dad." Emily's lips parted slightly. She studied his face for a long moment. Then, in a soft, almost fragile voice, she whispered, "Who is Emily?" The drive home was silent. Emily sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't fidget. She didn't ask questions. She only stared out the window, watching the world go by with a strange sort of detachment. Richard tightened his grip on the steering wheel. She doesn't remember me. The thought burned in his mind like an open wound. But how could she not? He had imagined this moment for years. Finding her, bringing her home, making up for lost time. But now, all he could feel was an unsettling sense of unease. He glanced at her again. She hasn't blinked once since we left the hospital. That night, Richard made her favorite meal. Or at least, the one she used to love when she was 6. Spaghetti with too much Parmesan. Emily sat at the table, posture stiff, fork in hand. She didn't eat, didn't even move. Finally, Richard cleared his throat. "Emily, are you okay?" Slowly, she turned her head toward him. Her expression was blank, unreadable. Then, in that same soft voice, she said, "I don't think I belong here." A shiver crawled up Richard's spine. "What do you mean?" Emily's gaze drifted to the walls, the ceiling, the flickering light above them. "I think I was somewhere else before." Richard frowned. "Do you remember where?" She didn't answer. Instead, she picked up a napkin, placed it in her lap, and finally took a bite of her food. The conversation was over, but the weight of her words lingered long after the dishes were washed. That night, Richard woke to the sound of footsteps. Soft, slow, right outside his bedroom door. His breath hitched. "Emily?" He turned on the lamp, hesitating before calling out, "Sweetheart?" No response. Cautiously, he got up, stepping toward the door. He could still hear her, just outside, pacing. His fingers hovered over the handle. Then silence. He exhaled. Maybe he was imagining it. Maybe she was just getting a glass of water. But as he reached for the door, a whisper, right on the other side. Soft, delicate. "I remember now." Richard's blood ran cold. Then the floor creaked. The footsteps moved away. Richard stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, before finally gathering the courage to open the door. The hallway was empty, but the attic door was open, and Emily was nowhere in sight. Richard's body tensed as he stood at the foot of the attic stairs, staring into the inky blackness above. The wooden ladder groaned under his hesitant weight as he climbed. The air was stale, thick with dust, the scent of age was clinging to his nostrils. Emily had never been up here. At least, not before she disappeared. The attic was filled with forgotten remnants of their past. Cardboard boxes sealed with brittle tape. Old photo albums stacked on top of rusting metal trunks. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly. And then he saw her. Emily stood at the far end of the attic, facing the wall. Her back was unnaturally stiff, her head tilted slightly as if listening to something Richard couldn't hear. His breath hitched. "Emily?" She didn't move. A cold unease slithered through his veins as he stepped closer. "Sweetheart, what are you doing up here?" Emily turned her head just enough for Richard to see the corner of her mouth curve into a slight smile. "I remember." Richard swallowed hard. "Remember what?" Her fingers grazed the dusty surface of an old wooden chest. "This place." Richard's stomach nodded. He had never let her in the attic as a child. There was nothing up here for her. So how did she remember it? She lifted the lid of the chest. The hinges groaned in protest. Richard stepped closer, heart pounding, as Emily reached inside. Her fingers disappeared into the darkness of the chest before resurfacing, holding something small. A stuffed rabbit. Emily's stuffed rabbit. The one she had when she was 6. The one she had on the night she vanished. Richard felt his throat tighten. It had been missing for 14 years. How was it up here? Emily turned, clutching the rabbit to her chest. Then she whispered, "I never left." The next morning, Emily was different. She moved through the house, silently, like a shadow. She sat at the kitchen table, stirring her cereal absently, staring at the wall. Richard tried to act normal. "Did you sleep okay?" Emily didn't respond. His grip on his coffee mug tightened. He had barely slept, his mind replaying the attic over and over. The stuffed rabbit, the way Emily whispered those words. "I never left." He needed answers. He had never asked Emily where she had been all those years. The police hadn't given him much information, just that she had been found at a facility, her memory fractured. Now, he wasn't sure he wanted to know, but the question left his lips before he could stop it. "Emily, where were you?" She blinked, as if coming out of a trance. Then, softly, she said, "Here." Richard's breath caught. "What do you mean, here?" Emily tilted her head slightly, like she was trying to remember something important. Then, finally, "I was waiting." A sharp chill ran down Richard's spine. "For what?" Emily's eyes locked onto his. Her voice was hollow. "For you to find me." That night, Richard bolted awake to the sound of whispers. Low, faint, coming from Emily's room. His heart pounded as he slid out of bed, moving cautiously toward the hallway. The closer he got, the clearer the whispers became. Soft, childlike, he pressed his ear to the door. Emily wasn't alone. He could hear another voice. It was thin, distant, almost like it was coming from the other side of a wall. A lump formed in his throat. Who is she talking to? His hand hovered over the doorknob. He hesitated, but then the whispering stopped. The silence was suffocating. Richard's pulse thundered in his ears. Then, creak, the door opened on its own. Emily was sitting on the bed, her stuffed rabbit in her lap, her eyes fixed on the open closet across the room. Richard followed her gaze, his stomach twisting. The closet door was slightly ajar. A long, dark gap stretched between the frame, leading into nothing but blackness. Richard's breath hitched. Was someone in there? He turned back to Emily. "Who were you talking to?" Emily's lips parted slightly. Then, in a voice that sent ice through his veins, she said, "The girl in the closet." Richard's body went rigid. "What girl?" Emily finally turned to look at him. "The one who never left." The words settled in Richard's mind like a slow-moving poison. The one who never left. His fingers trembled against the doorframe. The air in the room had grown thick, suffocating, as if something unseen were pressing against his chest. Emily sat perfectly still, her stuffed rabbit clutched tight. Her eyes remained locked on the slightly ajar closet door. Richard swallowed. "Emily, there's no one in there." She didn't blink. "Yes, there is." A chill slithered up his spine. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that it was just her imagination. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. Not after last night. Not after the attic. Not after the rabbit. He forced himself to take a step toward the closet. The wooden floor groaned under his weight. With a slow, measured breath, he reached out and gripped the door handle. It was ice cold. He yanked it open. The closet was empty. Nothing but old sweaters, a few boxes stacked in the corner, and shadows pooling in the dim light. He exhaled, relief washing over him. See? No one's. Thump. Something inside the closet shifted. Richard's breath caught in his throat. His eyes darted to the pile of boxes. One of them had moved. For a long moment, silence stretched between him and Emily. Then, very softly, she said, "She doesn't like to be seen." Richard's blood ran cold. She? His mouth was dry. He knelt, cautiously reaching toward the box. His fingers trembled as he pried open the lid. Inside was another stuffed rabbit, just like Emily's. But this one was old, decayed. The fabric was frayed, the eyes missing. A deep brown stain spread across its torso, seeping into the stuffing. Richard's fingers recoiled. Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. That was hers. Richard's throat tightened. Whose? Emily finally looked at him. The other girl, the one who was here before me. Richard didn't sleep that night. He sat in the living room, staring at the frayed rabbit on the coffee table. He knew every detail of this house. Every crack in the walls, every loose floorboard. There had never been another girl. Had there? His mind raced. Was Emily hallucinating? Was this a side effect of whatever trauma she had endured? Or worse, had she been telling the truth all along? The silence of the house was unbearable. Every creak of the walls sent a fresh wave of unease through him. Then, a soft pattering of footsteps. Emily. Richard pushed himself up, moving toward the hallway. But as he neared her room, something made him stop. Emily was standing in front of the mirror. The dim glow from the nightlight cast long shadows across her figure. She was barefoot, her hair slightly disheveled. But she wasn't moving, just staring. Richard's pulse quickened. Sweetheart. She didn't turn. As he stepped closer, he noticed something wrong with her reflection. Her lips were moving, but no sound came out. Richard's breath hitched. Then he saw it. In the mirror, Emily wasn't alone. A second figure stood behind her. A girl. Her features were warped, her skin too pale, too stretched. Her eyes, black holes sinking into her skull. Her mouth hung slightly open, as if whispering something into Emily's ear. Richard's body went rigid. He could only see her in the mirror, not in the room. He lunged forward, grabbing Emily's shoulders and yanking her away from the mirror. She gasped, blinking rapidly as if waking from a trance. Richard spun to look back at the reflection. The girl was gone. His chest rose and fell with heavy, panicked breaths. Emily clutched his shirt, her small hands trembling. Her voice came out fragile. "She's mad at you now." Richard felt something ice-cold brush against his neck. The whisper was right beside his ear. "You shouldn't have seen me." The lamp flickered. Then the room plunged into darkness. The darkness was suffocating. Richard's pulse pounded in his ears as he held Emily close. His breath came out in uneven gasps, his mind struggling to process what he had just seen, or what had seen him. A whisper, a presence, something that was never supposed to be there. Emily clutched at his shirt, her small fingers ice cold. "Daddy," she whimpered. Richard reached for the nightstand, fumbling in the black void. His fingers finally grazed the lamp switch. Click. The light flickered back on. The room was empty. The mirror reflected only them. Richard's pale, shaken face and Emily's frightened expression. There was no sign of the girl. No whisper. No shadowy presence lurking behind his daughter. But the air felt wrong. Charged. Like something had been disturbed. Richard took a slow, shaky breath. "It's okay, sweetheart. I'm here." Emily didn't answer. She only turned her face into his chest, her body rigid. His eyes flicked back to the closet. The door was slightly open, just as it had been before. The pile of old boxes sat undisturbed, except for one, the box that had held the rabbit. It was gone. A cold sensation trickled down his spine. Had Emily moved it? Had he? Or had something else? Richard swallowed hard, scooping her up in his arms. He needed answers, and there was only one place left in this house he hadn't searched. The basement. The door creaked open with an agonizing groan. A thick, musty scent hit Richard's nose as he stepped down into the basement, his flashlight beam cutting through the stagnant air. He had barely set foot down here since moving in. It was mostly just storage, old furniture, forgotten belongings left by previous owners. Emily clung to his neck, silent. Richards got twisted. What was he even looking for? A rational explanation? A sign that this was just his mind playing tricks on him? But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be that simple. His flashlight passed over shelves of dust-covered books, a rusted metal filing cabinet, stacks of wooden crates. Then it landed on the wall. Richard's breath caught. At first glance, it looked normal. Just another section of chipped brick, aged and worn. But something was off. The bricks in the center were a different shade, newer, as if someone had patched a hole not too long ago. His pulse quickened. Why would someone seal off part of the basement? A horrible thought crawled into his mind. What if something or someone was inside? Emily stirred in his arms. She doesn't want you to open it. Richard froze. He turned to her slowly, dread twisting in his chest. What did you say? Her small hands gripped his shirt tighter. She's inside. A cold sweat broke out on his skin. His hands trembled as he stepped closer to the wall. Then he saw it. A faint, childlike handprint smudged in dust near the bricks. His stomach lurched. He grabbed a crowbar from the tool bench. With a deep, shuddering breath, he wedged it between the bricks and pried. The first brick came loose with a reluctant crack, crumbling at the edges. Then another, and another. The hole grew wider, revealing a dark, hollow space behind it. The air that seeped through was stale. Then Richard's flashlight beam landed on something inside the wall, and his heart nearly stopped. A tiny, rotting stuffed rabbit, identical to the one Emily had. His stomach clenched. His breath hitched. He reached in with shaking fingers, lifting the decayed toy from its tomb. Then he saw it, a piece of faded fabric. He swallowed hard and pulled again. A dress, a tiny, tattered dress. The walls closed in around him. His breath turned shallow, his skin cold with realization. Someone had been buried here. A child. Emily pressed her face into his shoulder. Now you know. Richard's pulse thundered in his ears. Who? Why? He turned sharply to Emily, his voice unsteady. Tell me the truth. Who is she? She looked up at him, her eyes dark and unreadable. Her next word sent a chill through his bones. She was me. Richard's breath hitched. What? Emily reached out, touching the edge of the broken wall. Before I was Emily, I was her. The room seemed to tilt. A deep, resounding thump echoed behind the bricks. The air grew thick, suffocating. Then, a whisper. Let me out. The flashlight flickered, and the darkness came alive. The whisper clung to the air like damp fog. Let me out. Richard's breath hitched in his throat. His fingers tightened around the rotting stuffed rabbit, his mind struggling to process what he had just uncovered. The wall, the dress, the handprint, and Emily's words. Before I was Emily, I was her. His daughter stood motionless beside him, one small hand resting on the broken bricks. Her eyes were deep, dark pools, far too knowing for a child. Richard's grip on the flashlight trembled. He forced himself to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily, what do you mean? She didn't answer right away. She only turned toward him, her expression unreadable. She was me before, a long time ago. A cold knot twisted in his stomach. This wasn't possible. This wasn't logical. Yet, deep inside, he had felt it all along. The eerie familiarity of the house. The unexplainable occurrences. The way Emily spoke in riddles, as if she remembered something far beyond her years. A deep, dragging scratch echoed from inside the wall. Richard stumbled back, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then came the whisper again. Let me out. The bricks rattled. The very foundation of the house groaned, as if something within it was waking up. Emily stared at the broken wall, her small hands clenched at her sides. She's not supposed to be here. Richard swallowed hard. Who? Emily turned to him, her voice steady. The one pretending to be me. Richard's knees nearly buckled. Emily, what are you talking about? You're my daughter. She shook her head, her expression calm. Too calm. She took my place. A frigid wind swept through the basement. Though there were no windows, no doors open to the night air. The flashlight flickered wildly, its beams struggling against the thickening darkness. Richard felt his hands grow numb. If you're not Emily... He hesitated, his throat dry. Then who is upstairs? Emily's lips barely moved as she answered. Something else. A loud crash came from above. The sound of furniture toppling over, glass shattering. Then a single, drawn-out scream. Richard bolted toward the stairs, his legs barely carrying him. Emily followed in silence, her small feet not making a sound. The second he reached the living room, his blood turned to ice. The furniture was overturned, the coffee table shattered. Curtains billowed from an unseen force. And in the center of the chaos stood her, Emily, or something wearing Emily's form. Her dark eyes snapped toward Richard, and for a moment, just a moment, he saw what lay beneath them. Something hollow, something ancient. A twisted smile crawled across her face. "Daddy, where did you go?" Richard took a step back. "You're not my daughter." The thing tilted its head. The air grew suffocating, pressing against his chest like an invisible weight. "Aren't I?" The real Emily stood behind him, quiet, watchful. The false one took a slow step forward, her bare feet silent against the wooden floor. Her hands twitched at her sides. "I waited for so long," she whispered. "I needed a family. I needed a father." Richard felt the walls closing in, the house itself trembling. The energy in the air grew sharper, vibrating like static. Two Emilys, one real, one not, and the thing pretending to be his daughter had no intention of letting him go. Emily grabbed Richard's hand, her small fingers icy cold. "You have to send her back." His pulse thundered. "How?" Emily turned to face the imposter. "You know how." And suddenly, Richard did. The wall, the bricks, the thing that had been locked away was never meant to be freed. His body moved before his mind could stop him. He lunged forward, grabbing hold of false Emily. She let out a shrill, inhuman wail. Her body twisted, her limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. Her fingers dug into his skin, sharp as claws. Richard fought against the searing pain, dragging her toward the basement, toward the wall. The house screamed. The walls trembled. The air turned thick with static. The false Emily thrashed, her voice morphing, shifting, becoming something else. "No, I belong here." She was gone. She was gone. Richard shoved her against the broken bricks. The darkness within the hole seemed to reach out, pulling at her. Emily stepped forward, her voice no longer that of a child. "You took my place. Now give it back." A blast of wind tore through the house, howling like a storm. The false Emily let out a final, ear-splitting shriek. Then she was gone, the bricks collapsing on themselves. The air settled. The silence that followed was absolute. Richard gasped, collapsing against the wall. His hands were shaking. His entire body was trembling. Emily stood beside him, looking at the now-sealed wall. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then she turned to him, her expression softer now. "I'm real now." Richard met her gaze. "You were always real." Her small fingers curled around his. "She won't come back, but we can't stay here." Richard nodded. He didn't need to be told twice. As they stepped out of the basement, the house behind them sighed. A deep, settling breath. A house finally at peace. And Richard knew, as he carried his daughter toward the front door, that he would never, never look back.